I start my day believing my marriage with Sarah Khan is perfect. I come home and say, "Sarah, I am back." She smiles and replies, "Welcome home, Armin." Her voice feels normal, but something inside me feels slightly off. I sit with her and say, "How was your day?" She answers quickly, "Fine, just busy with Aisha." I nod and say, "You talk to Aisha a lot these days." Sarah laughs softly. "She's my best friend, Armin." I smile, but I notice her phone lights up again and again. I ask, "Who keeps texting you?" She hides the screen and says, "Just office group chats." I believe her because I trust her completely. At night, I see her sitting alone in the kitchen. I ask, "Why are you awake so late?" She replies, "I can't sleep." I sit beside her and say, "You seem different lately." She looks at me and says, "You are just overthinking." I say, "Maybe I am, but you feel distant." She replies, "Work stress, nothing else." The next morning, I accidentally see her phone on the table. A message appears from someone named D. It says, "I miss our future together." My heart freezes. I whisper, "Sarah, who is D?" She quickly grabs the phone and says, "No one important." I ask again, "No one important talks about future with you?" She snaps, "Armin, stop doubting me." I force a smile and say, "Okay, I am sorry." But inside my mind is shaking. I meet my friend Hassan later and tell him, "I think something is wrong with Sarah." Hassan laughs and says, "You are imagining things, Armin. She loves you." I say, "But she hides her phone." Hassan replies, "All wives do that sometimes." I try to believe him and say, "Maybe I am overthinking." But my thoughts keep returning to that message. At work, my boss, Mr. Rayhan, calls me and says, "Armin, you are distracted lately. Focus on your work." I reply, "I am fine, sir." He looks at me and says, "Personal issues can destroy performance." I nod and say, "I understand, sir." He adds, "If something is wrong, fix it before it spreads." I leave his office thinking, even he can see I am changing. That evening, Sarah tells me, "I'm going to meet Aisha." I ask again. She says, "Yes, she needs me." I smile and say, "Okay, come back early." After she leaves, I whisper, "Why do I feel like I am not part of her life anymore?" I call Hassan again and say, "I can't ignore this feeling." He replies, "Then talk to her properly." I say, "I tried." She shuts me down. Hassan says, "Then observe quietly." I stand near the window watching the road and think, am I losing her or just my imagination? The silence answers nothing. I whisper again, "Sarah, please don't be hiding something from me." But deep down, I already feel a crack forming in my heart. Before sleep, "Sarah, if you are hiding something, I will know it soon." I hear no answer, only silence in the house. I remember her smile, but it no longer feels real. I sit at the edge of the bed and say, "I trusted you more than myself." Phone rings. Hassan says, "Armin, don't lose yourself over doubt." I reply, "Maybe I already have." He says, "Sleep, talk tomorrow." I say, "Good night." I look at Sarah sleeping and think, this is my wife, but why does it feel like she's already gone from my life? I turn and close my eyes, feeling the distance between us grow. I start noticing small changes in Sarah's routine, and I tell her one evening, "Sarah, you've been going out a lot these days." She looks at me and says, "I told you, I'm visiting my mother, Nazia." I nod slowly and reply, "Every other day." She sighs and says, "Armin, stop questioning me like this." I force a calm voice and say, "I'm not questioning you. I'm just asking." She replies, "You're becoming suspicious for no reason." I stay quiet, but inside I say, something doesn't feel right. The next day I call her mother and say, "Aunt Nazia, is Sarah with you?" There's a pause. She replies, "No, she didn't come today." My heart tightens and I whisper, "She said she was there." Her mother says, "Maybe she got busy." I reply, "Yes, maybe." But after the call, I sit alone and say, why would she lie? I meet Hassan in the evening and say, "Hassan, Sarah is hiding something." He looks at me and says, "You're thinking too much again." I answer, "I checked. She wasn't at her mother's house." Hassan frowns and says, "Maybe she went somewhere else." I reply, "Where?" He shrugs and says, "I don't know, Armin." I whisper, I need to know the truth. That night I decide, I will follow her tomorrow. My heart feels heavy as I wait for morning. The next day, I tell Sarah, I have extra work today, I'll be late. She nods and says, okay. I look at her face and think, she didn't even ask why. I follow her quietly from a distance. I whisper to myself, don't get caught, Armin. My hands shake on the steering wheel. She stops near a luxury restaurant. I park far away and say, why here? I watch her walk inside and whisper, please don't make this true. I enter slowly and see her sitting at a corner table. My breath stops when I see a man sitting with her. I whisper, Danish Ollie. Sarah is smiling. She says softly, you always understand me better. Danish replies, because I know what you need. They laugh together. I stand frozen and say under my breath, what am I seeing? Sarah places her hand on his hand. I whisper, no, this can't be real. My chest tightens as I watch them act like a couple. I step back and think, my wife with another man? My vision blurs for a moment. I whisper, I need answers. I leave the restaurant before they see me. Outside, I lean against the wall and say, breathe, Armin, breathe. I drive home in silence and keep repeating, this is just a misunderstanding. But my heart refuses to agree. That night, Sarah comes home late. I look at her and say, where were you? She replies, with Aisha and friends. I stare at her and say, really? She nods and says, yes, why? I take a slow breath and say, I saw you today. Her face changes for a second. She quickly asks, what do you mean? I say, I saw you at the restaurant. She immediately says, Armin, you're spying on me? I reply, answer me first. She says firmly, I was meeting a business friend. I ask, holding hands? She shouts, you're imagining things. I stay silent. Inside I say, I saw everything clearly. She looks away and says, Danish is just helping me with work ideas. I reply softly, it didn't look like work. She says, stop controlling my life. I whisper, I'm your husband. She replies, that doesn't mean you own me. I feel something break inside me, but I say nothing. Later I call my sister Zoya and say, I think Sarah is lying to me. She replies, Armin, don't jump to conclusions. I say, I saw her with a man. Zoya asks, did you ask her directly? I answer, she denied everything. Zoya says, then you need proof, not emotions. I whisper, my emotions are already destroyed. Hassan starts avoiding my calls. I say to myself, why is everyone distancing from me? Sarah becomes colder each day. One night she says, I want freedom in my life. I ask, freedom from what? She replies, from expectations. I say, what expectations? She answers, marriage pressure. I feel shocked and say, what are you saying? She says, people change, Armin. I whisper, change or escape? She continues, I want a future where I can breathe. I ask softly, and I'm not part of that future. She doesn't answer. That silence tells me everything. I sit alone and say, so this is it. I'm already being removed from her life. But I still don't know the full truth behind Danish, Sarah, and the life she is building without me. I sit alone at my office desk and whisper, I need answers now. I open my laptop and say to myself, if Sarah is hiding something, I will find it. I look at Mr. Rayhan and say, Sir, can you help me access travel records for a personal reason? He raises an eyebrow and replies, Armin, this is serious. I say, I just need the truth. He sighs and says, give me the details. I lower my voice and say, my wife, Sarah Khan. He pauses and says, I shouldn't be doing this. I reply, please. After a long silence, he says, okay, but only once. I whisper, thank you. Later he calls me and says, check your system. I open it and say, what is this? I see repeated entries, Sarah Khan and Danish Ollie traveling together. My hands shake and I say, months, this has been going on for months. I lean back and whisper, she lied to my face every day. I walk outside and say to myself, breathe, Armin, don't break yet. I call Hassan and say, we need to talk. He replies, I'm busy. I say now. We meet and I say, did you know about Sarah and Danish? He goes silent. I say louder, answer me. He lowers his head and says, yes. I freeze and whisper, you knew? He says, I didn't want to hurt you. I shout, you already did. He says, Sarah made me promise. I step back and say, so everyone was lying to me. Hassan says, Armin, it's complicated. I reply, no, it's betrayal. My voice breaks and I whisper, my own friend, hiding this from me. He tries to touch my shoulder, but I move away and say, don't. I leave and feel like my world is collapsing. I whisper, I trusted all of you. At night, I meet Inspector Bilal and say, I need help. He looks at me and says, what happened? I say, my wife is cheating and I have proof. He leans forward and says, do you want revenge or justice? I stay silent for a moment and say, I want truth and control. He nods and says, then stop acting emotionally. Start collecting evidence properly. I ask, what do I do first? He replies, document everything. No confrontation yet. I whisper, I can do that. Days pass and I start recording messages, timings, movements, everything. I say to myself, now I am not blind. Sarah notices my silence and says, why are you acting strange? I reply, nothing. She says, you're becoming controlling again. I look at her and say, am I? She says, yes, you are suffocating me. I reply softly, I am just asking questions. She says, stop questioning my freedom. I whisper, freedom from me or from truth? She ignores me and leaves the room. Later, I hear her talking on the phone. I quietly stand near the door. She says, I can't wait much longer. I whisper, who is she talking to? She continues, yes, Aisha. I will leave Armin soon. My heart stops. I whisper, leave me? She says, my future is with Danish. I feel my entire body freeze. I whisper, so it was never confusion, it was planning. She continues, he doesn't suspect anything yet. I step back silently and say, I was already replaced. My hands shake, but my mind becomes calm in a strange way. I whisper, so this is the truth. I sit alone and say, I beg for love, while she planned escape. Something inside me changes. I whisper, no more begging. I look at my phone and say, now I will act differently. I call Hassan, but hang up. I say, no more depending on anyone. I stand in the dark room and whisper, Armin is gone. Only truth remains. That night, I decide I will no longer be the victim. I say quietly, if she wants a new life, I will help reality destroy her illusion. I stop crying. I stop pleading. I start planning everything in silence. I change completely. I stop reacting emotionally and start acting strategically. I say to Inspector Bilal, for now on I want facts, not feelings. He replies, good, because feelings will ruin your case. I nod and say, then help me collect everything legally. I start gathering proof with his help every day. Inspector Bilal says, you are finally thinking like someone who wants justice. I whisper, I am done being the victim. One day, Cameron contacts me secretly. I say, who are you? He replies, I am Danish Ali's business partner. I say, why are you telling me this? He says, because he is destroying everyone around him. I ask, do you have proof? He says, yes, financial fraud and hidden deals. I whisper, send everything to me. He replies, check your encrypted email. I open it and say, this is bigger than I thought. I stop trusting my emotions completely. Sarah notices my silence and says, why are you acting so different? I reply, nothing has changed. She says, you are not the same Armin anymore. I say, people evolve. She says, this feels cold. I whisper, truth feels cold. Hassan comes back and says, I need to talk to you. I say, I have nothing to say. He says, please, I made a mistake. I reply, you chose silence over loyalty. He says, Sarah made me promise. I say, and I paid for it. I turn away and refuse to continue. Sarah starts feeling pressure from Danish. I whisper, now the real him appears. Danish begins controlling her more. I say, so now she understands? I prepare legal documents with Mr. Rayhan. Mr. Rayhan says, you are ready for court if needed. I say, I am ready for anything. Sarah's mother Nazia comes and begs me to forgive. I stay silent and say nothing. She says, please save this marriage. I whisper, it already ended. I look at everything I collected. I say, now I am in control. I whisper, not Sarah, not Danish, not anyone. Sarah thinks she is winning freedom. I say, she is walking in her own trap. I sit alone and plan everything silently. I open my files and say, every truth has a cost. Inspector Bilal says, are you ready for what you may learn next? I reply, I stopped being afraid long ago. He says, good, because this will get worse before it ends. I say, I can't handle it. I receive another file from Cameron. Cameron says, Danish ruined many lives before yours. I whisper, so I'm not the first. He says, no, but you'll be the one who exposes him. I say, then I will finish this properly. Sarah comes home and looks at me differently. She says, you feel distant. I reply, maybe I'm learning clarity. She says, you scare me sometimes. I whisper, good. Hassan calls and says, please forgive me. I say, forgiveness is not available anymore. He says, I lost my friend. I say, you lost me the day you stayed silent. Sarah argues, I need space to breathe. I reply, then breathe without me. She says, you are not the Armin I married. I whisper, correct. Inspector Bilal says, now wait for the final move. I say, I am already there. I look at the city and feel nothing. I whisper, Armin is gone. I say, only truth remains. I sit in silence and review every file again. Inspector Bilal says, you are building a strong case. I reply, I am building the truth. Camera messages me, Danish is planning to leave the country soon. I whisper, not before I finish this. I call Inspector Bilal and say, he is escaping soon. He replies, then we move faster. I say, do it. Sarah looks at me and says, why are you so calm? I reply, because I understand everything now. She says, that scares me. I whisper, it should. I sit alone and say, control is finally mine. Inspector Bilal says, final stage is coming. I reply, I am ready. Hassan tries again, please talk to me. I say, there is nothing left to talk. Sarah says, I'm tired of this marriage. I reply, so am I. She says, then let me go. I whisper, you already did. Inspector Bilal says, final arrest is ready. I say, then end it. I stand in silence, waiting for truth to arrive. I whisper, this is the final shift. Sarah calls and says, I think we should separate. I reply, already separated in your heart. She stays silent. I whisper, that silence is your answer. Inspector Bilal says, everything is ready for exposure. I say, then expose everything. Cameron says, Danish is already trapped financially. I whisper, good. Sarah says, what have you done? I reply, the truth you avoided. She cries, you ruined everything. I say, no, you did. Inspector Bilal says, final action begins now. I whisper, let it begin. I sit and say, now I am in control. I add, no more fear. Sarah says, I regret everything. I reply, regret comes late. Inspector Bilal says, case is closed after this. I say, then close it. I stand and whisper, I am no longer the victim. I say, I am the outcome. Hassan says, I lost everything. I reply, you lost me first. Sarah whispers, I was wrong. I say, yes. Inspector Bilal says, everything is ready for final execution. I reply, do it now. Cameron says, police are moving in. I whisper, finally. Sarah cries, please stop this. I say, it is already done. Inspector Bilal says, Danish is arrested. I whisper, so it ends. Sarah says, I lost you. I reply, you never had me. Hassan says, I am sorry. I say, too late. Inspector Bilal says, case closed. I whisper, freedom is mine. Sarah says, I ruined my life. I reply, you chose it. Inspector Bilal says, you are free now. I say, I finally breathe. I walk outside and say, everything I built from pain is now truth. I whisper, no more lies, no more pretending. Sarah calls behind me, Armin, please. I reply without turning, my name is not for you anymore. Inspector Bilal says, it is over. I whisper, then let silence speak. Hassan says, you changed completely. I reply, truth changed me. Sarah says, I want you back. I whisper, that version is gone. Inspector Bilal says, final report submitted. I say, then it is done. Sarah cries, I am alone. I reply, you chose that path. I whisper, and I chose freedom. I stand in silence as Inspector Bilal arrives and says, it's time. I reply, then do it. My voice feels calm, almost empty. He nods and says, stay behind me. I whisper, I always have. I see Danish Ali entering the building. I say, quietly, so this is the man she chose. Inspector Bilal signals his team and says, move. Officers surround him immediately. Danish shouts, what is this? Inspector Bilal says, you are under arrest for fraud and financial crimes. Danish laughs nervously and says, this is a mistake. Cameron steps forward and says, it's not a mistake. I whisper, truth finally speaks. Danish looks at Cameron and shouts, you betrayed me. Cameron replies, you destroyed too many lives. I say softly, and mine was one of them. Sarah arrives at the scene and freezes. She says, Danish, what is happening? I watch her face carefully and say nothing. Inspector Bilal says he has been operating illegal financial networks. Sarah shakes her head and says, no, this can't be true. Danish yells, Sarah, help me. I whisper, even now he uses her. Inspector Bilal says, we have proof and testimony. Sarah turns toward me and says, Armin, tell me this is not real. I reply, I told you truth was coming. Her eyes fill with tears as she says, you knew. I say, I found out. She steps back and whispers, I ruined everything. I feel nothing. I say quietly, yes. Danish is taken away as he shouts, you all will regret this. Inspector Bilal replies, justice doesn't regret. I whisper, neither do I. Sarah collapses slightly and says, he lied to me. I reply, you believed him. She cries, I trusted him over you. I say softly, that was your choice. She walks toward me slowly and says, Armin, please listen to me. I stay still and say, I am listening. She cries harder and says, I made a mistake. I didn't know the truth. I reply, you never tried to know it. She says, I was confused. I say, confusion doesn't last months. Her voice breaks as she says, I loved him. I whisper, and you erased me while doing it. She falls to her knees and says, please forgive me. I look at her and feel nothing inside me. No anger, no sadness, just silence. I say, get up. She looks at me and says, I lost everything. I reply, you lost it when you chose him over truth. She cries, I made a mistake. I step back and say, mistakes don't erase damage. She whispers, I still love you. I pause and say, love doesn't build betrayal. She reaches for me and says, please don't leave me. I look at her hand and step away. I say, you planned a future without me. Now I'm living mine without you. She breaks completely and cries loudly. I turn away before I feel anything return. Hassan arrives and says, Armin, I'm sorry for everything. I reply, I already moved past it. Zoya stands beside me and says, you look different now. I say, I feel different. Mr. Rayhan says, you handled this better than anyone I've seen. I reply, I had no other choice. Inspector Bilal says, case is officially closed. I whisper, then it is finished. Sarah cries behind me, but I do not turn. Hassan says, she is breaking. I reply, so did I. Zoya says, what now? I look at the empty road and say, now I leave. Mr. Rayhan says, where will you go? I reply, anywhere that has no memory of this place. Inspector Bilal says, you are free now. I whisper for the first time. I start walking slowly. Hassan says, don't forget us. I reply, I won't. Sarah calls my name loudly. Armin. I stop for a second, but don't turn. I say, I am not the same person anymore. She cries, please stay. I whisper, I already stayed too long in pain. I continue walking as her voice fades behind me. Zoya follows a few steps and says, You're really leaving? I say yes. She asks, for good. I reply, for peace. Inspector Bilal says, Take care of yourself. I nod and say, I will. Hassan stands silent and says, Goodbye, brother. I reply, Goodbye. Sarah screams again, but I finally say nothing. I just walk forward. The city feels different as I leave. I whisper, Everything is over. No anger remains. No revenge remains. Only silence. I say to myself, I didn't destroy anyone. I add, karma did. I keep walking and feel something I never felt in years. I whisper, I exist again.